This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 164 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Is it functional to work on parts of speech? Is sentence diagramming actually useful? How do we improve word retrieval in kids with developmental disabilities, and is it similar to what we do for an adult with a brain injury? How can we make therapy academically relevant and functional beyond just getting a good score on a standardized test? I invited speech-language pathologist and language therapy advanced foundation student Katy Wyatt to the show to share answers to these questions. I'm always excited to connect with people who are using the frameworks I teach because I'm always amazed at some of the creative ideas they come up with to expand on what I've given them. So if you're a language therapy advanced foundation student and you want some practical ways to use the tools I've given you, you'll really enjoy this interview. And if you've been lurking and considering whether the program is for you, this will give you an idea of what you'll learn if you do decide to join. Katy Wyatt graduated from California State University in Los Angeles in 2017 with a Master of Arts in Communication Disorders. After moving to North Carolina, Katy has worked in Head Starts, homes, schools, skilled nursing facilities, and assisted living facilities with clients ranging from 11 months all the way to 99 or older. Katy is a board-certified cognitive specialist and has also been certified in the SOS approach to feeding. Katy currently works in the schools full-time with kinetic physical therapy and wellness. She works with students to improve their language, articulation, and fluency skills, develop alternative means of communication, and improve their social and academic functioning. Katy also serves as the compliance coordinator and SLP assistant supervisor with Speech Inspirations, PLLC. In this conversation, we discuss the parallels between therapy for aphasia and child language disorders, why therapy focused on vocabulary and background knowledge can also address executive functioning skills like the ability to self-question, generate and evaluate ideas, and plan or execute them. Parts of speech and sentence diagramming, how to embed this kind of work into structured but contextualized activities. The concept of syntax as a vocabulary skill, and how to help kids understand what words mean and what words do. Why it's impossible to define what vocabulary skills are age appropriate at each grade level, and how to reframe the way you think about scaffolding across grade levels and varying student needs. And we also talk about generalization and how to focus on explicit instruction of content and strategy in direct therapy, while also giving students retrieval tools that they can use outside of sessions. As I mentioned before, Katy is a Language Therapy Advanced Foundations member. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program for SLPs and other specialized service providers who are supporting students in the areas of language and literacy. If you struggle to make your language therapy relevant, if you find that it takes a long time for you to plan for your sessions, but you feel like you're still not seeing the results that you know your students are capable of, then definitely check out the program. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, please enjoy this interview with Katy Wyatt. Today I'm joined by Katy Wyatt, an SLP from North Carolina. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much. I can't believe that I'm here.
Yeah, so I would love to have you start off with just sharing a little bit about yourself, like what's been your professional journey up until this point, and what are you doing now?
I did take a little bit of a circuitous route to becoming an SLP. I was actually originally an international security studies major, and I was learning Russian and Spanish. And after studying abroad in Russia, I realized that it was really hard having all my friends and loved ones 12-hour time zone difference away from me.
Oh,
So I tried
imagine that.
yeah, humans need connections. What? So after I graduated, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Originally I was thinking about doing like FBI, but then I found out I'd have to be a police officer and push-ups are not my happy place. So I was looking for something else, and I knew I liked languages. And one of my friends, my roommate actually in college, her mom was a speech therapist in the schools. So she let me come and observe her, and I was like, wow, this is really different, but I feel like I could be good at this. So I did a post-bac program at Cal State Los Angeles. While I was doing my program, my grandfather actually was diagnosed with mesothelioma. And while he was going through that, I was actually taking a class, and my professor was like, hey, Katy, the things you're describing sound like a brainstem stroke, and it sounds like your father or your grandfather has dysphagia. And so I went to the medical team and talked to them about it. And the oncologist at the time said, well, even if he had a stroke, it wouldn't matter.
Why would it
Um,
not matter?
that's a great question. And I guess because it's not cancer, I don't know.
Huh.
um,
Well, it's interesting how people get in they have their thing they're focused on, you know?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because my grandfather was pocketing food. He had lost like 60 pounds in 3 months. He was like just dropping weight, getting very confused, eating very little, choking on food in restaurants and things like that. And so, sure enough, he did have dysphagia. He actually developed aspiration pneumonia, and that's the reason why he passed.
Oh my
So
gosh.
he passed right when I started my post-bac program. So I've always had a very like soft spot in my heart for dysphagia populations as well because of going through that experience. So I went through my grad program. I got into the speech pathology. I got to do my school placement at Dooley Elementary School in Long Beach, which was really cool because it is a very diverse school. They have a lot of students who are, lower SES,
Hmm.
a lot of students who are from immigrant populations, a lot of English language learners. And so I got to have some really cool experiences there. And then my hospital placement was at Rancho Los Amigos, which is like a national trauma center.
Wow.
Um, and I was in outpatient TBI. I actually got to participate in the ABIDRC, which is Acquired Brain Injury Day Rehab Group. So that was also a really fulfilling experience. So coming out of college, I was like, "Ugh, I'm going to be a hospital SLP. I'm going
That's
to
what I
only do
did
that."
too.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah. I'm always like, "Ugh, I don't need to know about these other things." I thought I was
Uh-huh.
going to do cleft palate and work at a
Me
children's
too. That
hospital.
was one of my things. And voice.
Yes. Voice, not so much for me, but cleft, yes. And I was like,
Yeah,
"Ugh, I'm going to do this." And life has a funny way of taking you in other
it
directions.
does. Uh-huh. I know
So,
that.
yeah. So my clinical fellowship was in a high school. And that posed its own unique challenges.
Hmm.
Then I went to private practice for a little bit. I did a little bit of feeding, mostly early intervention and, in-home interventions. Then I ended up working at a skilled nursing facility for a 13-week contract. And then I shifted over to the assisted living facilities. productivity standards are terrible.
Yeah, that's
And
a
I
whole
was burning out.
conversation.
Yeah. So I ended up going back to the schools, but I still continued to work for the assisted living facilities outside of school. So I was doing PRN assisted living facilities, PRN private practice, and full time schoolwork. And nowadays I am working for a private practice and also still working in an elementary school.
Wow, you've really had the mix of when we think about language and cognitive and just all the different pieces that go into thinking about the language piece as well as the cognitive piece. You really had quite the mix. So, wow, yeah. So it's so interesting how a personal experience can kind of push you in a direction or have you like have this aha moment because with dysphagia, I know that like I also have done some work in skilled nursing facilities, not as much as the schools, but you really have to train people on what your scope is. And I think that that's really interesting. I was actually having a conversation with some people where I work where they were educating the people who were making referrals on their operating procedures for making the referrals, which is part of the piece, but then they were like left the person who was receiving the referral out of the conversation. And I was like, okay, that makes no sense. Referrals are a partnership, both parties. The person who has the expertise is the one that needs to be educating and making the referral as well. And it has to go both ways. So I think with dysphagia, a lot of times people don't realize. You say I'm a speech therapist. They don't think, oh, well, swallowing, even though it's this, within our scope. And I know that language, yes, speech language pathologist, that's in our job title, but people just say speech teacher or a speech pathologist and leave out the language piece. So that happens there as well. And I think that people don't realize with the cognitive aspect how global that is. And then in the schools, you have the literacy piece where I feel like we're always constantly having to educate people about what we do. So yeah.
For sure.
So gosh, yeah, there's so much I could say about what you said. So I'm curious about because you've had a lot of experience with TBI.
Hmm.
I felt like so that was in my graduate program, and this was kind of an interesting turn of events where I had an extra slot where I could take a course my last semester or in one of my final semesters, and so I was like, oh, I have room to take the TBI course. That is the only course where we touched on executive functioning at all, and it wasn't
Really?
even that much. And it's embedded in there, and that you kind of get into it when you have aphasia and language disorders, but there's so much stuff that they have to cover relating to language. It's hard to explicitly talk about it. The only place that we really directly talked about it was TBI. And I'm wondering like where did you get your when you think about both of those pieces, language and executive functioning, like where did
Mhm.
you get your knowledge in that area, like pre-service and then out in the field?
Yeah, so it's kind of wild because the things that I got to do at Rancho are completely different than all of the things that I do with executive functioning nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we had like it was very, very discreet, very medical. There
Uh-huh.
was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
like, problem solving. And actually, the funny thing is, one of the exercises that we had everybody do was basically semantic features analysis.
Uh-huh.
I didn't
Yeah.
realize it at the time, but you would have this drill where every single week you would try to have them, like reach into a box and pick out a like item, and usually it was something very functional, like a cup or a hammer or a flashlight. And then they'd have to go through and describe it piece by piece, like what's it made of? What does it look like? What color is it? What size is
Yeah.
it?
Mm-hmm.
And the point of it was not for the language piece, but for the processing and speed of retrieval of that information.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, even in the hospitals, we were doing that. But then there was also a program called like attention processing something. I'm trying to remember
Hmm.
exactly what it was, but it
Yeah.
was actually basically a program that was auditory in nature, but you would go through these like increasingly complex tasks for attention, like, starting just as sustained attention and talking about like raise your hand every time you hear the word blue.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then it would get more complex where you had to be, selective. So it would be like you had sounds that you would play in the background and then you'd be reading and they would have to raise their hand every time that you said blue. And then it would keep chaining where, then it would be okay, raise your hand if you hear blue after you hear green. Raise your
Hmm.
hand when you hear these two different words, every time you hear one or the other of these words. Raise your hand when you hear the words in a certain order. And so that was something that we were working with. But other than that, like it was very much about problem solving. Let's practice how are you supposed to safely put on your socks now that you
Yeah. Yeah.
had this
The
injury?
cognitive
How do
stuff.
you, yeah, how do you make your favorite dish at home? A lot of things like that. So when I was in Rancho, it was very much like attention based
Hmm.
and like I want to say like executive functioning based insofar as being able to inhibit inappropriate
Hmm.
responses to
Yeah.
stimuli and promote appropriate responses to stimuli, which is always a loaded word. But, being able to focus on one thing at a time, being
Hmm.
able to,
Discrimination.
yeah, discriminate.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or also like being able to come up with a solution that would be safe.
And relevant, and like
Yeah.
you have that the generation of ideas, and then the evaluation of the ideas, and then the selection of the ideas, and then the execution of thinking, in advance, and the planning and all that. But
Yeah, and if any one of those links breaks down, the results could be catastrophic.
yeah. Yeah. So that's really interesting, because I would say that my experience was similar. And a couple things. One, I agree, like with semantic feature analysis, the way that I brand it for my program specifically is you're building vocabulary, you're supporting word retrieval. And a lot of times when people think building vocabulary, they're like, you think expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary test, where you're just naming and identifying. And yeah, that gives us a little picture of something, but its vocabulary is so much more than that. And so you need to engage in these these tasks that require you to retrieve and generate and self-question and use a strategy for pulling information out and explaining it and articulating it. So I see semantic feature analysis as an executive functioning strategy as well, even though I don't necessarily always explain it that way, because a lot of times I'm talking to school SLPs who are thinking about, how do I build background knowledge? How do I build vocabulary so I can support my students' reading comprehension and ability to access their curriculum? But I think, I mean, the way that I see it, good language therapy is embedding executive functioning. So you're really working on both at the same time. But then in order to do really good executive functioning intervention, you have to do that clinical piece, but you also have the whole piece of coordinating all the support in their environment and executing that.
A lot of the times, the way that I explain it to my kids
Yeah.
is I say that this is how your brain organizes the information that you need. And
Yeah,
this is how
totally.
your brain figures out how to find the information. And as we were sitting here, I was also thinking about the fact that actually, even within aphasia communities,
Yeah.
this is one of the strategies that people will teach in order to be able to help people with
Mm-hmm.
anomia, word finding
Yep.
difficulties, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And so it really does go across, but it's just very interesting because based on the way you talk about it, it really changes how people respond to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think too, it's you have this, you encounter a word and you don't know what it means. Can you sit there and kind of figure it out? Like, do I know information about this, or do I need to go look for more information about this? And I think that process, it helps with that as well. I know we were talking before we hit record about the parallels between what we do with adults and what we do with
Mhm.
kids. And in my graduate programs, the way that the curriculum was structured was here's school age language, and then here's aphasia, and here's TBI,
Yeah.
and here's what we work on with adults. But really, we're thinking about the brain all the way through the lifespan. And yes, there are different neurological reasons why someone might struggle with language or executive functioning, whether it's they have ADHD or developmental language disorder or autism, or they've had a traumatic brain injury, or they're an adult that has dementia. And so, yes, all of these things have their own unique differences. And the person who is experiencing that is, depending on where they are in their life and what they're doing, you've got to factor that into your treatment. But at the same time, the process is still similar. So I'm curious what that was like for you, because you had a lot of experience with adults. You were thinking medical, which I was actually thinking that as well. And then you came over to the educational setting. So what was that like for you, and what kinds of things were you struggling with when you made that transition over to the schools, figuring out how to navigate your role?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me, what always frustrated me was the feeling of being kind of scattershot.
Uh-huh.
Like, you have a random goal targeting this, and then you have a random goal targeting this. But like
Uh-huh.
all those pieces don't necessarily come together. And the feeling of, okay, great, now they're using categories. Is that improving their ability to function in the classroom?
Yeah.
Okay, great. They can describe something. Are they using it functionally within their speaking or writing?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the times I couldn't really point to it and say, like, yes, this is having such a great improvement on X, Y, and Z. And I
Yeah.
feel so effective because I'd run into this repeating sensation of, okay, great. I just taught them how to use he and she, but they're not using it in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't the issue with their sentences anyway.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
so it was so I felt very inept. I
Mm-hmm.
felt very inept at language therapy. I felt very much like I was just hitting goals in order to hit the goals. And, there wasn't necessarily great carryover from one week to the next. And I wouldn't necessarily see them carry over the skills from one week to the next or across like environments or across partners. And it was just very much like, yes, I'm technically making progress on their goals, but I don't know how much progress on their language that they're
Yeah.
actually making.
Yeah.
Um,
Like
and so,
real outcomes, not just what it says on this piece of paper that I have to check off.
exactly, exactly.
Mhm.
And I mean, like, I'm one of those people where I want to do things right. I want to make sure that
Yeah.
people are actually making progress and that I'm not just saying, okay, they met their goals, they're done.
Hmm.
Because, I think something that is easy to lose sight of is that speech therapy is not just about meeting speech goals. Speech therapy is about helping people function within their environment.
Hmm.
And so, like, yes, we're targeting those specific goals so that people can function in their environment, but you can't divorce them from each other. You can't miss the forest for the trees. You can't miss the trees for the forest.
Yeah. That's such a tricky balance, because when when I talk to people who are at more of the policy and leadership level, you do need all of those compliance things and the paperwork and the data, because when you're looking at things at a macro level, you need a quick snapshot to make decisions. So it's like you can't take that away, but you have to figure out how to do it in a way that is actually giving you something meaningful. And I think that's really hard to do. And I know it's really easy to just be like, because there's been times where I'm working with, you're working with a student, or I'm mentoring someone working with a student, and I'm like, this is just thinking about this data or these goals is actually taking away from helping this person right in front of me. And I would think that the people in the leadership positions would be concerned about that as well. And I'm sure that they would be. But yeah, that is such a tricky balance. So I know that you have gone through language therapy advanced foundations and used some of those strategies.
Mhm.
So I would love to know, because we've talked about semantic feature analysis, which is something that I teach in the program, but what kinds of things when you started to use the framework, really the concept of the essential five and using
Mhm.
that as a skeleton for your treatment, what kinds of takeaways did you have that shifted the way that you practiced?
Yeah, so I've been really trying to hone in on kind of the vocabulary piece and helping my students understand what we're doing and why.
Mm-hmm.
The whole metacognition thing has been a really big thing for me,
Mm-hmm.
because I really try to help those students understand, like, hey, why are we doing this?
Yeah,
Something I
that's
tell
a
them
big
is
one.
everything we do we're doing for a reason. I'm not just making you do it to do it. What do you think that reason is? And so I actually have these like open discussions with my kids about, like, yeah, this is how you show when a verb happened. Yeah, this is how you show how many of that noun there is, things like that. So the use of metacognition and also self questioning have been really, really transformative for my practice because I also have been seeing just how beneficial it is for the kids to be able to do that framework when I'm not even there.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to hear about that because people
Yeah.
always worry about that. Like, are they carrying over or I only have 30 minutes? How do I make sure that they're benefiting when I'm not with them?
Yeah, exactly. So it always feels really silly and really stupid when I'm doing it. And the kids always look at me like I'm crazy. And I use it with all the different ages that I work with. So, like, you know, I don't tend to do it with my preschoolers, but I'll do it with my kiddos, like basically kindergarten up.
Okay.
Um, but what I do is I turned the self questioning questions into a song and I put it to songs that the kids already know. And I paired it with visuals and hand motions that kind of help give the idea of the question. And then I taught the kids the songs line by line using both forward and backwards chaining.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, do you do that for verbs, nouns, and adjectives? Because I
Yes.
know, like, for people who use the expanding expression tool, that one, Sarah Smith has a little chant that she does for the nouns. So you kind of have one option there, but you've expanded it and you have one for other types of words as well.
Yeah. So I have one song per word type. And
Okay.
I go through the word types in a certain order because for me, something that I've found to be really, really effective is to go through first nouns because they're more concrete. It has the most questions. And those are the words that are going to be your subject in your sentence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I go through verbs because that's a little bit more abstract, but you can still see it, you can still do it, you can still talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's going to be your predicate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I take a break from the, semantic features for a minute so that we can talk about subjects and predicates and we can talk about identifying them. And then I do a little bit of like sentence charting, I guess I could say.
Or like
Um,
what are they? Like sentence diagramming and that kind of thing. Well, and
Kind of,
even just
yeah,
syntactic study, like looking at the parts of the anatomy of a sentence. No one calls it
exactly.
that, but that's what it is
Exactly.
when we're
So
talking
I
about
have them look for
syntax.
the whole subject and the whole predicate.
Hmm.
Um, and I have them circle the subject and squiggly underline the predicate. It doesn't have to be that, but I try to keep it consistent because when we are getting longer and more complex sentences, having that same structure for every single one of the clauses helps them be able to see what goes with what.
Yeah,
So,
that's a big one.
yep.
Hmm.
So I keep it consistent. So, I still come back and circle back to like the nouns and the verbs. And, sometimes I'll try to do it with their classroom vocabulary, which can be tricky because it may be words they don't even know. you know,
Yeah. You almost
um,
have to look at the words and the definitions too, because
yeah,
sometimes they don't know what the words are that are supposed to clarify the other words. You're
exactly.
using hard words to clarify other hard words. That doesn't really
I
always
know.
work.
This is what drove me nuts about learning Russian because yes, like I
Yeah.
would be like, let me look in the dictionary. I don't understand a single word in this definition.
Yeah. Yeah. They
So
need to have the
yes.
self-awareness to realize when they don't understand the words in the definition. Usually, I mean, if you can get to that point where someone can articulate that they don't understand the words in the definition, you're really getting somewhere.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so throughout that, just
Yeah.
by having that like order of like
Mm-hmm.
nouns, then verbs, then clauses, I can also start to integrate in the definition syntax from
Mm-hmm.
Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. Um, because what I'll do is I'll be like, guess what, guys? You're going to make awesome definitions today. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah. And I'll tell them kind of like how to put each of the questions that we have into the definition. So we'll like do a semantic feature analysis of a noun together. And I'll write down, the category that we come up with and like the attributes and the, composition, function, all those things. And then I'm like, okay, now put your category, your what kind here. Okay, pick one of these things that we talked about. Okay, great. You just made your own definition. And then I'll kind of have them go around and say their definition. And I'll look at the other group members and be like, hey, is that right? And usually they're like, yeah, you know. So it helps them build their confidence, but then also it's giving them a context to see how that song actually relates to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. That is the one of the biggest challenges. Like, so I did a study on the EET for my dissertation, and we didn't see a significant impact on when we compared what the regular classroom vocabulary instruction looked like and the expanding expression tool lesson looked like. And we were doing group lessons, not therapy, comparing those two things. So I had one teacher using the expanding expression tool for an enrichment period and one teacher just doing whatever they were normally doing for their vocabulary enrichment. There wasn't a significant difference. Now, I think if I would have maybe gone a little bit longer for my intervention period, it might have continued to go because there was a difference. It just wasn't statistically significant. But I think the thing that I was missing was the syntactic element and the giving them some kind of a retrieval strategy, because when we went and collected our data, they had gone through and they could use this strategy, but they didn't realize in that moment when they went to go and describe this word for my graduate students who were collecting data for me, they didn't realize, oh, that thing I did over there, I can pull it into here. And so you have to teach the strategy, but then you have to teach a retrieval mechanism for that strategy. And I think that's what we were missing. And I think that if we would have added those elements, then we would have seen more of an impact. And that's why, like, I didn't necessarily see a significant impact, but I still use a strategy because I see it as we just were missing some key pieces. And I know that there is a lot of research to show the benefit of things like self-questioning and studying semantic features. So, but yeah, what I wanted to say about that example that you shared is that I do get a lot of questions about, should I work on parts of speech? Should I work on sentence diagramming? Should I teach people to identify nouns, verbs, and adjectives? And I'm like, yes, but not the way people typically do it. A lot of times it's like, is this a noun? Is this a verb? Is this an adjective? And that's it. And you're kind of just categorizing. But what you described is a very contextualized way to have that conversation. You're showing them where it's relevant to know if something's a noun or a verb or an adjective. You have to know, like, what do I do with this word and where do I put it when I'm explaining something to someone? So all those things that you described are a great way to make it more contextualized. But it's still structured enough. You can do it in a therapy session and do it with the enough intensity. And then you can have another way to bridge it over to something even less structured, like you're writing an essay in class or something like that. I think that sometimes people don't know how to go from structured to super functional. There's like this black hole in the middle of like, okay, we just jumped and went over here without putting a lot of structure in place. And I wanted to take a quick break here to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program for SLPs and other special service providers who are providing language therapy for their students to support their academic skills as well as their functional day-to-day skills. Some of the most common things that people share with me relating to language therapy are: I don't know where to start. I don't know how to make my therapy functional. How the heck do I organize all these skills to be able to take data and write goals that I can measure, but also that are meaningful? Or how do I make sure that my therapy is academically relevant, but still what my students need? And how do I do all that and not spend hours and hours planning and prepping? If you have experienced any of those things, you are certainly not alone. This is actually what inspired me to go back and get my doctorate and specialize in language and literacy, because when I started out as an SLP, I did not feel like I had a clear protocol, and as a result, I was spending a lot of time compiling things and putting things together, but not really seeing my students make the progress that I knew was possible for them. So if this sounds familiar to you, definitely check out Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. In this program, I give you a framework for creating a system for language therapy that gives you enough structure that you can minimize some of that cognitive fatigue that you experience when you spend so much time starting from scratch for each student, but at the same time helps you to ensure that you are being evidence-based, but still individualized based on your students' needs. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Well, and also, so something really cool that I've been seeing. So when I initially started doing the song, I was just trying to think, because I was like, okay, if I give these kids a list of questions, I am setting them up for failure because nobody can memorize just a list of questions. Like, that's
Yeah.
just not how our brains work. So
No.
I started
No.
with the noun song. And initially it was just a song, but then I was like, you know what? Why don't I incorporate some hand movements? And the hand movements actually did two really interesting things. Thing number one is it made it kinetic, so,
Mm-hmm.
or kinesthetic rather. So people could actually feel the questions, if that makes sense, and like
Yeah.
have a movement. But the other thing too was that the hand movements actually turned into a visual cue for my students as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if they weren't able to remember the question, I could start to do the hand movement and that would trigger the question for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, you know, we started off with all of us doing the song together. Then we backed up to doing the song one line at a time. Then we back up to them doing the song. And what I've been doing this year and trying to be really intentional about is I will actually tell them, like, hey, don't just sing the song. The song is not about the whole song, it's about the parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So slow down, because if you keep going, you're just going to confuse yourself and you're going to miss a question. And so getting them to remember where they were in the song and to slow down and think about the question that they just sang. And then I would say, okay, now ask yourself the question. And so now we're at the point where, especially for the noun songs, because I hit that one really hard because I'm just
Yeah.
like, you can't do anything in a sentence without the noun. Uh,
Yeah. And it's the most
but
concrete. It's a really good place to start.
yes, it's the most
Mhm.
concrete. It's going to be your subject, which means that it's going to be the thing that the whole sentence is about. And, you just have to be able to find it. You got to be able to
Mhm.
find it.
Yeah.
But the kids actually have gotten to the point where they can use the hand movements now to do the song silently so that they can ask themselves the questions without saying anything out loud, which has not yet, but I'm hoping will help it transfer to the classroom because they can do it in their desk or to the side and not be visibly doing anything different, but they're cueing themselves on how to retrieve that information.
Mhm.
So that's
I
been something really cool this year.
That is really cool because I think that one, sometimes people feel silly doing something out loud, and sometimes you need that cue if you're not doing it internally yet. But if you have something else to facilitate that, you've got another tool in your toolbox. And I know it's like that we could go off on a conversation about that. I just had a really interesting conversation with an OT about the sensory processing aspect where she's saying, I'm not claiming to work on language and cognition the same way that an SLP would, but some of these things that I do with movement can help unlock things
Mhm.
to help people to benefit from the things that they're doing with the SLP. So using movement,
Mhm.
using the sensory aspect to pull it out or enhance what you're already doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and don't get me started about talking about co-treats because then you might need like another 3 podcasts. But
Oh yeah. Oh, that would be a good one.
oh, I love co-treats. But yeah, I mean, my kids look at me like I'm crazy, and I'm always like, just hear me out, just do it, just try it. You're gonna look silly. All of us are gonna look silly. I'll look silly first, you
Yeah.
know. But I did that for literally all of the different word types. Well, not like all of them. I did them for nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've just started introducing conjunctions to my kids this year. And I was like, okay, I have something to tell you. There are kinds of words other than the ones that I told you about. And my kids were like, what? But, they're getting to the point where I can be like, yeah, what kind of word is that? Is that a noun, verb, or adjective? And they'll think about it and answer. And, um, you know, they'll go through the hand motions to help them remember where they were in the song. And these are just skills that they did not have before, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah.
And the teachers, when I talk to them, they're always like, well, yeah, that's nice, but, I can't do that. They don't need to do that. I've had people tell me that the things I'm working on are inappropriate because they haven't reached them in the curriculum yet. And I'm like, they
So
haven't.
they haven't reached them in the curriculum, but some of the students are doing them implicitly, and that's why they're successful in the curriculum. And these
Exactly.
students are coming to therapy because they can't do it implicitly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, like, for example, one of the one of those things where I felt vindicated was there was like a game that the principal had the staff play earlier this year. And it was something where basically you were trying to find like connections where like each
Mm-hmm.
person was given like a word. And so you would have like one person who had milk and one
Mm-hmm.
person who had cookies and one person who had cream. Like those are the only ones I remember, but like
Yeah.
it wasn't necessarily all just food related. But I was in the hallway and one of the teachers had cookies and the other teacher had milk. And so the teachers took a picture together because milk and cookies go together. And then as they were going down the hallway, I could hear the kids in that class going, oh, we need to find somebody else because if they have cream, cookies and cream could be one. Oh, yeah. And then also, like chocolate chip, if you have that, then it's chocolate chip cookies. And like they were going on like that. And I was like, yes, because your students do this implicitly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I have to teach it explicitly because if implicit was enough, then they'd be already doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I almost think I it's frustrating because you feel like you have to sell yourself, just like that conversation we were having earlier about the dysphagia thing. But I do also think that it is part of our job to be able to make those connections for people because they've got so many other things. Like it's their job to think about how students are progressing in the curriculum. And they have so much pressure on them to do those things. And then, you think, oh, well, why do they have pressure on themselves? Well, because the administrators are saying we need to do this. Why do the administrators? Well, because they have a school board. And why does a school board? Well, because they want to make sure that their community is progressing. And so it's like this whole cascading effect. So I see us as that we have to know all of those things and know all of those interests that people have relating to their jobs and just ethically, like everybody is there thinking, I'm doing what I need to do for my students. And I know that, like with a lot of the SLPs, they're saying, well, I'm worried that my therapy isn't aligned with the curriculum because it doesn't look exactly like the curriculum. And I always tell them if it's helping them access the curriculum and it's the missing link, then it is aligned. And I think that sometimes if you can find something that a teacher is struggling with and like really focus on that with something that you'd already be working on in therapy, and like, even have like an individual case study where they see this small win, then that can help them to buy in. But you have to figure out what they care about and how to make those connections between those two things. And I think that's a good example of what you just said. Like if you could show that what you're doing would help your student participate in that activity and come up with some ideas and participate more and answer some questions, or whatever else they're wanting to do in that situation, it can really help to kind of, I'd say, grab the low hanging fruit and get your foot in the door with some of the teachers that you're working with.
Oh yeah, I mean, my favorite is when I come in, I'm like, "Oh yeah, like, do you have anything that you want me to work on with them? I was just gonna work on this today, but I could work on that instead."
Yeah.
They're
Hmm.
like, "Oh, well, actually, this is what we're working on in the classroom today." And I'm like, "Okay, cool. Well, then I'll go with my original plan." And then I take the child and
Yeah.
you know. But also actually thinking of extensions for, language therapy advanced foundations. Also, something that I've been finding really helpful is using semantic features analysis as a way to help students organize information in order to do compare and contrast tasks.
Oh yeah,
Because
that's a good
I
one.
feel like that's one
Mm.
of the big ones where the teachers are like, "Oh, look at this Venn diagram. They put nothing." And,
Mm-hmm.
I think of semantic features analysis also as a content generating strategy.
Oh,
Um,
100%. Mm-hmm.
because kids don't know where to start,
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
when they're looking at something and they're trying to say, is how is it the same? How is it different? It may even just be apples and oranges, but unless you know that they're both fruits, you won't be able to say that they're the same that way. Unless you
Mm-hmm.
know that you eat them both, you won't be able to say that they're the same that way. You might not be able to think about the fact that people also use them to make juice or, that they're different colors or different sizes or different shapes. And so that's something that I've been doing too, even for my like littles. I'll say
Yeah.
like, yeah, they'll be able to think of some features in order to be able to compare and contrast because that's something that they're expected to do. But if you don't even know where to start.
Yeah. And I think part of it too, what you were saying before about how you have different retrieval tools for different types of words, and then you were going to expand it to conjunctions, is that you really need to know how to use semantic features and use that strategy. With you have to have mental flexibility to know how to use it. And part of the way we can start to get kids going in that direction is to show that there's different questions that you would ask for a noun versus a verb versus an adjective. And then that's a good opportunity to talk about what is a noun, verb, or an adjective in context rather than in some kind of an isolated situation. And I know, but a while ago, a few minutes ago, you were talking about conjunctions. And I love that because a lot of times when people think vocabulary, even when we think about the reading rope, which is, trending right now, they think of syntax as this siloed off thing and not as part of vocabulary. And that's why I harp on that so much in the Essential Five framework, because a conjunction is a word type and vocabulary is not just content words, it's function words too. So,
Yep.
yeah, where did you like, what are some ways you expanded on that when you started to pull in the conjunctions?
Yeah, so in the past, I wasn't super organized about it. Like I would be
Yeah.
like, okay, well, compounded sentences are easy, so we're just going to go through fanboys real quick. We're going to use it, and then we're going to move on.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah,
but I never
fanboys
saw.
being the acronym of the coordinating conjunctions.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah.
So I always start with compound because I think that compound, it's a lot simpler. It does not move like
Hmm.
complex sentences can be. Like compound sentences, you know where the conjunction is going to be.
Yeah.
The two clauses are equally important, you know.
Yep.
And it also is a really good place to start for introducing, how does this word change the relationship of these two ideas?
Ooh, that's good. Love
Yeah,
that.
and so that's what we've been doing for the past few weeks. So, like, I gave my kids a break last week, not this last week, but the week before, and I let them read questions and answer WH questions, and they were like, "When do we get to play the card game?" And I was like, "That wasn't a game, but I'm so happy you like it."
Oh,
Uh,
I love that because people are always like, how do I make this interesting? Aren't we going to incorporate some games into this? And I'm like, well, if you do it right, they're going to like it because they're going to feel successful.
uh-huh.
all in how
And
you frame
so,
it.
yeah, thank you. So, but what we've been doing for the past couple of weeks, and we've just started doing it again, was I actually went through and did basically an explanation of each one of the fanboys.
Okay.
And I basically like went through and made sure that they understood what it was saying. So I was like, for means the same as because, and like and is combining two ideas together, and nor means neither one of these are happening, and that whole kind of thing. And then I also did get to go a little bit into sentence structure, because for
Hmm.
nor, I was telling my kids about how, oh yeah, like this sentence structure, one of your clues is it's going to look funky. Like the
Yeah.
second half of the sentence is going to look real funky. And we got to go through and like talk about, like word order for questions, word order for, sentences coming after nor. And like, we got to talk about how, yeah, no, normally that verb does not go first.
Hmm.
But for this
Yeah.
one, it does. Like, that's kind of weird. Um, and then we finally worked up to where in the last 2 weeks, I gave them a sentence that I wrote down. And then I had them basically take turns identifying subject predicate, conjunction. How did that conjunction change what it meant?
Mm. For complex or compound or
Just
both?
compound.
Okay.
Just
Do you have
compound.
a song for fanboys, the fanboys acronym as well?
No, no,
Maybe
I
we need to
don't.
create one for the professionals, because sometimes I have to I have to think about it sometimes if I haven't been talking about conjunctions for a while. Which I actually do talk about conjunctions a lot, so it's usually not an issue, but yeah, I find that people, one of the questions that I get a lot is that the most common ones, and even in the probes that I give, it's and but. So those are the two that come up the most, which in theory you have the most utility if you do focus on those, and that's why I give a lot of examples of those, and then people can kind of iterate on the other ones. But I mean, how have you been able to pull in the other ones that are less common, like you just gave some examples for nor. What
Mm-hmm.
do we have? For and
And
nor,
or,
but
but or yet so.
yeah, yet that would be an interesting one. I don't use that one as much, or
Yeah.
in my probes I don't use it as much. We use it a lot in language, but
Yeah. So for yet, I basically went through and I was like, okay, so for means the same as because. So when we think of for, that means it's a reason for something.
mhm.
And then, and we're putting together two things, nor neither one of these things are happening. Plus, there's that weird, funky sentence structure. So we're looking for not and weird sentence. Um, but is something that's unexpected.
Mm.
Not what we were thinking it would be. It's unexpected. It's a surprise. So like the first day I was, I drew like a little surprise face. Um, and then or is a choice.
Mm.
And
Okay.
then
That's good.
yet is the same as but. So if you can do but, you can do yet.
Interesting.
And then so I've been kind of waffling on so a little bit because I realized that it could be both the reason and the result of something. Um,
Yeah. And I think you
so
kind of it's good to say it's not always the same. It can be
yeah,
this or it can be that.
yeah. But then when they're going through, I'll, say like, okay, so remember, for means the same as because. Does because make sense here? No? Okay, then it's probably not for. And, are we putting two things together that are kind of similar? If it's not, then maybe it's not that one. And so we kind of would go through and reason it. And then for the ones where I know that some of them mean like the same, like yet, I'll be like, you know what, you're right with that one, but I want you to be fancy. I want you to use one that means the same. What's the one that means the same? And then if the kids can't remember, I actually have like a little whiteboard page that I put up next to the
Hmm.
therapy table. And I have like a word type of the week and then morpheme of the week. And
Mm.
so for the last month or so, it's been conjunctions. And so I have fanboys written on it. And then they'll look at the paper and like try to kind of puzzle through it. And then, they'll once they get it, usually my kids at least will be like, or no. yet,
Mm-hmm.
and they get really excited because, you know, I always tell them, like, yeah, what you said was right, but I want a different one, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we've been going through it. And I think they're starting to get it. I actually was really excited because I did language testing with one of my kiddos, and she was identifying them correctly in the self. She
Oh,
was starting
wow.
to use it. She was doing vocabulary tasks, like, so it was really cool to see it generalize, because sometimes I'm like, is this effective? And then, like, something happens and I'm like, oh wow, I'm so proud.
Yeah. And I love how you bring that up with the self, because so obviously when we're thinking about evaluating, we're not just thinking about norm referenced assessments. We're thinking about how are they functioning in the classroom? How are they functioning in their day-to-day life? In my therapy sessions with these activities that I'm doing, are they making progress with that? And also I know that there's the topic of standardized tests and formal tests and how useful are they is quite a debate, but there's been a lot of research that goes into those assessments. And so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We know that there are limitations with sensitivity and specificity with the self specifically, but it's still a tool we can use in part of this whole portfolio that we're pulling together. And I think that something that people stress about a little bit is, are they actually making progress on those norm referenced assessments? It's obviously not the only thing we want to look at, but that is really exciting when we're like, wow, their score actually went up, because that rarely happens. And what happens sometimes is that their performance goes up, but their standard score or their skilled score is not going to go up because of, like, they've gotten older, the
Mhm.
standard for what the raw score is has changed. So for a student with developmental language disorder to actually, quote, catch up, they have to go at a like a the pace that they have to go, and the trajectory that we need to see is a steeper curve. So it is really exciting when we can see those things, because it's a tangible thing that we can actually measure. So
Yeah,
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 that is exciting to see that. Um, I know that we only have a few minutes left. I have a couple more questions.
go for it.
Okay, so since we were talking about the um just some of the things and the ways that you've been able to iterate on the essential five framework, and I know that when you're coming from one setting to another and we're talking about language, it's overwhelming for people. And I know that a lot of people coming into the field, or even people who've been in the field for a while, who are kind of like, whoa, I'm this is a lot. And they're kind of feeling like, where do I start? What would you say to those people?
I would say look for something that jives with you philosophically, jives with your personal therapy style, but also gives you a framework and a structure to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we first started talking, I did say this repeatedly, that I feel like my work with the Language Therapy Advanced Foundations has been an iterative thing where,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
initially got it, and then life happened and I didn't get to actually finish it until the following summer. And then I started using it and I didn't feel effective with it. But that was the year that I found the semantic features analysis song idea. And I started doing that. And then a year passed with me doing the song, and I got other ideas. And so then I figured out how to incorporate semantic features into, like the sentence structures. And it's just been an iterative thing where, like, basically every year I come back and I'm like, what am I learning from Language Therapy Advanced Foundations this year? What am I
Mm-hmm.
taking away that I didn't get before? Because, it is a lot. It is a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not going to all come at once. But the other thing too is that you don't have to be perfect with all of it in order to
Oh,
be able
yeah.
to make progress.
Mm-hmm. That's a big one. And I know that, like, it's frustrating because a lot of times people are like, well, I want to go to a seminar and I want to, like, have something that I can go use right away. And you should have something that you start with. But Professional development is an ongoing process. You're not going to go to a seminar and then just have it all figured out. You're going to go to a seminar or watch a training or read an article or however you're consuming that content. And then you're going to try something and it's going to work a little bit, but then you're going to get stuck and you're going to need to come back and review it and get support and help and clarification on how you can problem solve through that framework and come back and, like you said, iterate on it. Like that's our own personal learning curve. And a lot of times it's like I found with my dissertation, it's not that I was completely off with what I was doing. It's that I didn't have all the pieces in place. And a lot of times you can see progress with some things, but not others. And then you just have to figure out how to fit all the pieces together. So, and I love what you said about how you don't have to have the whole thing in place to start seeing progress, because that's another thing. People are kind of like, well, I need to have the whole thing perfect before I can start. And I always say, no, go learn something and try it and come back and ask questions, because that's how you're going to learn to implement it effectively and learn how to customize it and expand on the things that you're learning in here.
Yeah. I mean, like, for example, for me, the thing that I really clicked with and was able to start really making my own is the semantic features analysis. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what I keep coming back to, keep coming back to, keep coming
Yeah.
back to. But, the semantic features analysis, once I had that down, I could start seeing how to apply it and integrate it into other things.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
I think having just a framework and having a cycle that you can kind of go through, because like at the beginning of the year, I just go back to nouns. I'm like, okay, we've learned the noun song. We learned it last year, but it has been a summer. So we're going to start over. And what that's done for me too is kind of help see the repetition deepen the understanding and the knowledge. And then you can do even more applications.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think that, just having something that you can come back to, that you can modify, that you can move up or down, you can use more complex words, you can use more abstract words, you can use more basic words if they're getting confused. Like, there's a lot that you can do with it. And I think that, it's allowed me to kind of unlock that part of my brain because I'm like, okay, I know how I'm going to be targeting this. So today all I
Mhm.
have to decide is what I'm targeting. And I like to use reinforcement games, but I pick like games that are very, very quick.
Yeah.
So it'll be like a full round of like doing hard work and then like a reinforcement round that's like 30 seconds,
Yeah.
Um, and that's been really good because it gives my kids time to kind of like reset, but then also I don't have to worry about it. Really, the only thing I have to worry about in any given session is what reinforcement game do I want to do today? And
Yeah.
then beyond that, I can just be like, yeah, no, I know what we're working on. Sometimes I change the plan, but it still fits within that framework. And I still
Mhm.
have a way to integrate it and target it without having to print out like 5,000 handouts.
Yeah, that's really key, because the framework in your plan is in your head and you're clear on the protocol. So you've made a lot of decisions up front. And that can, from a burnout standpoint and a cognitive fatigue standpoint of just yourself as a clinician, can be a game changer for a lot of people. And I know that the semantic feature analysis is one of those strategies that is, it's one of the first things I teach, and it is, as you said, a way that you can keep customizing it across the grade level. And that's what I think is challenging for people when they want a curriculum which really doesn't fit for what we do as clinicians. You can't say this is what is age appropriate, because that's kind of a loaded term, which sometimes applies but sometimes is counterproductive. um it's, you can't say these are the vocabulary words you have to know in second grade. These are the language skills you have to know at this age level. Like, you can't do that. And a lot of times people ask me for that. And you need the framework and you need to have a tool for pulling in the right information, like you just said, because then you can take the same process and apply it from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And just as you said, make it more complex, change the scaffolding, use different retrieval strategies. And that's how you customize it across the grade level without needing to start from scratch with what the process that you're using.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention too, something that I've found really helpful that I've been incorporating more is specifically in NC, there is a severity rating scale for like every area of communication. So like they have a voice severity rating scale, a language.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really like about that tool is that the standard scores are actually only one component of that tool. So
Interesting.
so basically, like different factors have like different point weighting scales, and you know, the standard score on the standardized tests is only the top row. And then there's additional information like how many different areas of language are actually impacted,
Mm.
um, based on, kind of what you see. How much support do they need in order to function in the classroom? Do they need a lot of redirection? Do they need the same amount as everybody else? And so you actually get the severity of deficit, which, obviously is a deficit-based model as opposed to a strength-based model, but also this is how you're supposed to qualify people, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I feel
but
like you could reframe it in the way that you explain it so that you're
right.
making it, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, usually what I'll tell parents is I'm like, hey, don't put too much stock into the severity. This is just so that I can quantify and be able to show why they
Yeah.
qualified. But really, what I want to focus on is what do they need from me and how am I going to support them? Is usually what I'll say during like the testing. But yes, I think that's really helpful because, again, every test has its issues and every test has its inherent biases and
Hmm.
oversensitivity and undersensitivity and
Yeah. Yeah.
overspecificity and underspecificity. And so I do think it's helpful to have something where you can go and talk to the teacher and be like, yeah, I saw these areas of concern. Do you see those in the classroom? How much support do they need, in order to be able to, function in the classroom? And that way, when I'm talking to the parents, I can kind of say, like, yeah, these are the factors that led me to think that, this is kind of where they're at and this is why they may benefit. So, you know, I even had a child very recently where her scores were technically within normal limits, but in the classroom, she's having difficulty with word finding and with sentence structure and with creating clear sentences. And I talked to the teacher and she said, yeah, no, she does need some additional supports. And so I talked to the team and I was like, hey, technically she had within average scores. However, these were the specific areas that I saw that she was having a little bit of difficulty, and the teacher sees some need in the classroom. And so, using that language severity scale, she did actually come out having some mild needs. Do we want to give her IEP supports, or do you think she would be better served by staying in the classroom? And we were able to have that conversation, and she did actually end up qualifying for
So
one time a week.
what is the name of that tool? It's the
It's called the language severity rating scale. It's
okay.
a it's
Okay.
a it's a tool through NCDPI, so it's
Okay.
like publicly available. But I just find it very helpful because, again, especially in the school setting, it's not just one thing. You know,
Yeah. So that is such a helpful example because number one of the biggest objections that I get when I say you need to do a portfolio assessment and an evaluation and a screening, it's a process, it's not a test. But people say, I don't have time for a process, and my district wants standard scores. And I always push back a little bit on that because I was in a district where, yes, we had protocols and requirements for standard scores, and I would use that. But a lot of times people have more wiggle room to I don't want to say negotiate, but build a case using something besides standard scores than they realize. And my question is always, how do you know that that's true? Like how do you know that you couldn't make a case for it using other factors and other descriptions and by creating a really detailed narrative description of their language? could you build a case for it using other data that you're pulling in besides your cell 5 or whatever it is that you're using? I know I'm like hating on the cell 5 a little bit, but
No,
I
it's
just know that
fine.
that's a
Don't
common one. It's a common language
yeah.
assessment tool where kids don't qualify and people are like, but I know they need help. What do I do?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but like the other thing that I was going to say is with that tool, with the time factor, I think people feel overwhelmed and you need a tool to structure the conversations and gather that information and have a conversation with the teacher, which I do a little bit in the spot manual that I provide in language therapy advanced foundations, but that tool that you gave that also gives a severity rating and a template for having those conversations and saying, here's all this other information in addition to this
Mhm.
score could be really helpful. So we'll definitely link to that. And
Yeah. I was also going to say, just super duper quick, in terms
yeah,
of an additional tool that is through NCDPI and I've been using religiously, there's also a classroom communication checklist.
ooh,
And
that would be really
so
good.
it talks about areas that the student has difficulty in across reading, writing, listening, and speaking.
That sounds really good.
And so I've used that religiously for the past, like, I don't know, 3 years now. And it gives really great information about how the child is functioning in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
because it goes basically from like never to most of the time. And
Yeah.
the teacher has room to write notes and they just kind of go through and say, like, do they have trouble with this? Do they have trouble with that? And sometimes I'll even share the information from that with like the school psychologist and the EC teacher, because sometimes it has information about their reading and writing that may not have come out on testing. So definitely, like, if other states are anything like NCDPI, which I would imagine they are, also
Yeah.
just take the time to look through those resources, because sometimes there's like hidden gems in there.
Yeah, and you can use it and customize it to make it appropriate for your district or your state guidelines, which of course is always a factor. And that's another reason why it's hard to be like, this is what's age appropriate because every state is different with what their policies are. But yeah, I think the other thing about those tools is that they can be a tool for having a conversation with another professional in addition to being a test or
Mhm.
something that's going to give you a score. Yes, you have a score that's quantifiable, but this is also a tool to structure your conversation and gathering of information. And that is the sticking point for a lot of people in why they don't do a detailed portfolio assessment. So it's kind of like it's streamlining your operating procedures as well. So we'll link to all that stuff. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share or mention that we didn't talk about before we wrap up?
I mean, I'm a talker, so that's a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, you made this easy for me. I'm just kind of chilling, letting you share all of your good stuff.
um, Yeah, I mean, I think that the other big thing to think about is that there are so many different approaches to therapy out there. There are so many different frameworks out there. And sometimes it can feel like they're incompatible. But
Yeah.
what I want to, recommend is just being flexible and finding what works for you. Speech is amazing in that it's a very wide open field, and the same program won't work for different people necessarily the same way, because we're all different people. We all have different strengths that we bring to the table. We all have different personalities and therapy styles. And so just think about what you can take from it and
Hmm.
don't necessarily stress about the rest, because,
Yeah.
it's not just what's evidence based. You are part of the evidence based triangle.
Hmm. I think that the therapy protocol, it needs to be diagnostic for the clinician as well. Like, some people are like very, I want to say like I'm kind of an analytical, I want to have my procedures and systems in place. And if that's not something that comes naturally to you and that's your missing piece, then you're going to want to find an approach that's going to help you build that side. And if you're somebody who's very systems focused, but you have a hard time with the engagement piece, maybe you find somebody who is focused a little bit more on that to kind of balance you out. Or
Yeah.
maybe you try both because you think both are important and you put them together.
Yep. Yep. I mean, putting it this way, if you asked me if I would be on the Dr. Karen podcast talking about my silly little noun song even like a month ago, I would have been like, what? Never. But, life has a weird way of doing things that you never expect. And
Yeah,
you're not going to
it
really
does.
know until you get the information and you trial and you error, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the learning curve for all of us. So, um, all right. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope people got something of value out of this. So
I'm
I'm
sure they
really excited
will.
to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for the resources that Katy shared, as well as the link to Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. If you are tired of spending so much time planning and prepping for language therapy, and you want to walk into your sessions confident with a plan, knowing that you're giving your students the skills that they need to succeed, then check out the program. You can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy to learn more. If you are interested in being a guest, or if you have a suggestion for someone who would be a great guest for the De Facto Leaders podcast, feel free to reach out to me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, it helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and feel free to share this with a friend or a colleague if you found this episode helpful. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.